Welcome to the launch event of the OECD report, Implications of Remote Working Adoption for Base Place Policies, a focus on G7 countries. We are pleased that there is too much interest in this topic, and thank you all for your participation. Special thanks to those participants coming and attending from the American continent early in the morning, and those from Asia Pacific late at night. Some quick instructions with this webinar. You have in the bottom right of your screen, you have the English and Japanese option for translation. So please check and click the English channel or the Japanese channel. You can raise your hand also and participate. And we know that you will have questions about this discussion today, so please share your questions through the Q&A function that you see it also in the bottom of your screen. We will have, as moderators, we are gonna see the questions and ask them to the speakers. So please do it along the presentation. I think with that, and now to officially open the event, I would like to give the floor to Mr. Jun Nakahara, Director General of National Spatial Planning and Regional Policy at the Ministry of Land, Infrastructure, Transport and Tourism of Japan. Please, Mr. Nakahara, the floor is yours.
Okay. 日本の国土交通省の国土政策局長をしております中原と申します。
Hello everyone, my name is Nakahara and I'm head of National Special Bureau and Regional Policy Bureau, MLIT Japan. It's my pleasure to deliver on behalf of the Government of Japan opening remarks at the launching event of OECD report on implications of remote working adoption on place-based policies with a focus on G7 countries. First of all, I would like to commend the work delivered by CFE under the leadership of Director Ms. Lamia Kamal Shawi. Through objective data and insight report sharing, through the engagement of governments and international institutions in a dialogue, CFE has largely contributed in each country's regional, urban, and rural policy. I also want to express our heartfelt appreciation for the fact that this joint research has brought Japan and CFE closer, deepening our ties. Starting from June 2020, together with CFE, we have identified and analyzed long-term effects COVID-19 had on G7 nations in terms of spatial policies, remote working, and each country's policy responses. So today, later on, the Secretariat will present the summary of our joint report containing our findings along with policy recommendations for better post-pandemic societies. And using this opportunity, I would like to reiterate the significance of this event with its strong message towards the global community and the stage for a roundtable by private sector and academia. Today, our country, Japan, faces various challenges brought by a shift in the demographic structure towards an aging population, declining birth rate, and rural depopulation. These factors significantly affect social, economic fundamentals of our life and are changing people's living as we know it. There is a chance that these challenges will become not only Japan's, but also a global reality going forward. COVID-19 has drastically changed the way we live and the way we work, making teleworking, workation, and remote meetings a part of our daily lives. These significant and rapid changes became a background for the recently published long-term spatial policy vision by MLIT, outlining Japan's spatial policy directions toward 2050 and oriented at enhancement of people's well-being while addressing spatial issues. This long-term spatial policy sets out the course toward development of a truly affluent nation amid recent changes, the ability to separate work from the workplace, and a greater flexibility in individuals' choice of work style, lifestyle, and work-life balance. Extreme concentration of population and companies in the Tokyo metropolitan area has always been viewed as a challenge for national spatial planning and regional policy. However, it seems that the shift to remote working due to COVID-19 pandemic has opened a path to rediscovery and finding out attractive remote areas across the nations. As factors once viewed as regions' disadvantages turned out to be less prominent, initiating populations outflow from big cities. While we all see the diverse impact of COVID-19 on each country's socio-economical state and people's migration patterns, it's important to look forward. In this regard, we are pleased to see multiple similarities in Japan's long-term spatial policy vision and CFE's report on implications of remote working adoption on place-based policy. In terms of insights derived and policy recommendations for post-pandemic societies, we sincerely hope that data and policy response recommendations laid out in this report will be instrumental in global nations' short-term and long-term policymaking. Let me close by wishing this event to be filled with takeaways for all participants and by expressing my gratitude to all parties involved for their kind contribution. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Nakahara, for stressing especially the relevance of this work for Japanese spatial policy. And now we are going to hear from the OECD, and I would like to give the floor to Mrs. Lamia Kamal-Chawi, Director of the Center of Entrepreneurship, SMEs, Regions and Cities of the OECD. Please, Lamia.
Thank you very much, Andres. The sound is okay?
It's perfect, yeah.
Thank you. Director General John Nakahara, distinguished panelists, dear colleagues, dear friends, I'm really delighted to be with you today to launch our new report, Implications of Remote Working Adoption on Place-Based Policy, a focus on G7 countries. And of course, I would like to thank Director General Nakahara and the Ministry of Land, Infrastructure, Transport and Tourism of Japan for the valuable support to make this report happen. The report comes at a critical time, with OECD countries adapting to the post-COVID world, where remote working is the new normal and has become an integral part of the way we work and the way we live. As the capacity for people to work remotely differs depending on where they live, actually, using new sources of real-time data, we have developed a number of regional development scenarios that could emerge from a greater adoption of remote working to develop policy guidance to help regions navigate this new normal. My colleague Enrique Garcilaso will soon provide a detailed presentation of the report, so I will myself focus my intervention on three main trends coming out of our work and the four scenarios that could emerge from the rise of remote working. The first trend that we have identified is that while the long-term impact of the pandemic on our societies is still unfolding, one thing is clear: COVID-19 has accelerated the digital transformation that has been underway for decades. Children with at-home internet access began attending class remotely. Mobile applications were developed to help track and trace the development of the pandemic, and artificial intelligence was employed to accelerate the search for a vaccine. Internet traffic in some countries increased by up to 60% shortly after the outbreak. And of course, many employees, including ourselves, start working from home, while numerous firms adopted digital business models to maintain operations and generate some revenue flows. In the United Kingdom, for instance, the share of population working remotely grew from 30% before the crisis to almost 50% during the pandemic. So the crisis has really catalyzed not just wider adoption as a short-term necessity, but also wider acceptance of remote working practices, which means that they are likely to stay, at least in a hybrid form, after the crisis. Several surveys conducted in G7 countries have revealed that a large majority of employers have a better now perception of remote working compared to before the pandemic. And we can see why. Remote working has already brought a number of benefits to people's lives, including reducing transport-related related to greenhouse gas emissions, and of course, more opportunities to improve work-life balance. But also, they have also saved costs for firms, and indeed, in many cases, led to increased productivity. However, the use of a more widespread remote working will need to be carefully managed, so the economic, environmental, and welfare gains it can generate actually benefit everyone. And the fact is that while accelerating digitalization, COVID-19 has also reinforced the importance of addressing pre-existing gaps in digital infrastructure and digital skills across places, workers, and firms. Across OECD countries, only 56% of rural households actually have access to fixed broadband with a minimum speed of 30 megabytes per second, which is far below the 85% seen in urban households. So the second trend highlighted in our report is that remote working opens new opportunities for rural regions to attract new residents, boost economic activities, and revitalize their communities. OECD data show that in recent decades, rural regions across OECD countries have fallen behind cities with lower growth in living standards and higher population decline and aging. We have seen that also in Japan, for instance. The rise of remote working has the potential to offset or even reverse this trend, as an increasing number of people are attracted to rural areas in search of more affordable housing, lower cost of living, and better environmental amenities. And firms that pay high location costs in cities could also find it profitable to either downscale or relocate part of or all of their headquarters outside the big cities. And for example, in Japan, a recent survey of 375 firms headquartered in Tokyo revealed that close to 14% of them are considering changing their real estate strategy because of the pandemic. And we have many other examples in many cities around the world. So, but despite all these new opportunities that remote working offers to rural areas, a massive exodus from cities is, however, not likely to happen. And this is the third key trend I would like to highlight from the report. Many large cities will indeed continue to attract the bulk of workers and firms because of the benefits associated with agglomeration economies. Cities understand that, they understand the potential threat of remote working, and many are already reinventing themselves to improve their livability and well-being of their residents. We have seen many cities around the world that have taken action, immediate action, since the beginning of the pandemic. And Paris, for example, where the OECD is headquartered, is redefining its urban planning and public transport strategy toward more compact and walkable neighborhoods around the concept of the 15-minute city. And cities like Tokyo are also leveraging changes in firms' real estate strategy to ease housing availability. So in light of these uncertainties regarding who will be actually the winners and losers of the shift to remote working, regional policy needs to play a key role in ensuring that competition to attract workers and firms actually leads to win-win economic and social scenarios. So to help policymakers make informed decisions to support all types of regions within their country navigate this new normal, we have developed 4 scenarios of settlement patterns that could emerge from the rise of remote working. The first scenario, we call it the city paradox, and is an extreme case of a permanent movement of high-skilled workers outside large city centers, while small cities and rural regions face greater demand for services and land. The second scenario is a case where commuting zones around cities expand as high-skilled workers move to the outskirts of large cities, thus creating a donut effect. The third scenario is the rise of intermediate cities, meaning mid-sized cities, towns, or semi-dense areas, which become increasingly attractive to workers with highly teleworkable jobs. And the fourth scenario is a business as usual case where there is overall a greater adoption of remote working, but workers remain in large cities to stay close to workplaces. So we are today very lucky to have with us international experts that will talk more about these scenarios. They will talk about the implication of these scenarios. And while much uncertainty remains, it is likely that this fourth scenario will not occur in mutually exclusive forms and will differ actually across countries and places. But regardless of how these scenarios unfold, changes in work patterns will continue to require regional development policy to be adaptive to emerging infrastructure needs, to business supports, healthcare and the environment, among many others. Our report discusses the different policy implications for these different scenarios, but one aspect that we can be certain of, whatever the scenario is, the need for a strong multi-level governance, which the report also stressed. So dear all, the acceleration of remote working and digitalization means that regional policy needs to be much more forward-looking than in the past. Technology is changing at a high speed, and a regional development policy needs to keep a pace. At the OECD, we stand ready to support this transition and assist regional policymakers in making the most of remote working for citizens, regardless of where they live. And as part of our efforts to support regions in their recovery, we are now establishing a new platform of good practices and data where we will, among other things, use foresight to look more closely at different scenarios for regional development with the aim of ensuring that we are ready, whatever the future holds. So thank you very much. And again, thank you to Japan, because it's thanks to Japan that we had the opportunity to do this very important work that will benefit all our member countries. Thank you.
Thank you, Lamia. Thank you for this thorough overview of the event and the messages of the report. Now we are going to move to the substance, and we are going to present the main takeaways of this report. I will give the floor to Enrique Garcilaso. He's the head of the Regional and Rural Development Unit of CFP and the CD. So please, Enrique, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Andres. Can everybody listen? The sound is okay? The screen is okay? Good, good. Thanks for giving me the floor. I will just briefly present the main results of this study, which is quite extensive. And as you can see, we've prepared a number of policy highlights in different languages, in English, Spanish, French, and Japanese. And let me go back to the slides. And before I start my presentation, I would like to raise a couple of issues. The first one is the current situation. There's still a great deal of uncertainty, and certainly in this analysis does not provide all the answers in this high degree of uncertainty. Our data and analysis mainly covers the year 2020 up to the first quarter of 2021. We know that it doesn't cover the third wave, but we do have quite a picture between the first and the second wave. We focus mainly on G7 regions from G7 countries. And we also make use of some novel data, tracking mobility, data in Mapbox, Google Mobility data, some unofficial data sources, in addition to more official and surveys. So we try to make use of a variety of tools, knowing that the scenario is still quite unstable, but hoping to get some idea of what mobility has been evolving during the pandemic and what implications it might have for the settlement of people and firms. Then the report itself has four main chapters. The first one is on tracking mobility. The second one is on understanding remote working and the main drivers. The third one has a special focus on labor market effects. And the fourth one, a little bit on the policy highlights. So the main results on the mobility, as we heard previously from our director and also from the main speakers, is when we looked at the tracking mobility, there's not this great change from urban to rural. We don't see that in the data. Rather, the data show us a couple of structural factors. The first one is the declines have been much greater in places with a bigger density. So the bigger cities suffered bigger declines and bigger recoveries too. And we think that's because of work-related activity and sort of like the halt of work-related activity. We don't pick up this trend from increase on rural and decrease on urban. We know that there's been a lot of media attention. The data doesn't confirm that. The third one is that mobility decreased everywhere. And then another finding is that the rankings didn't change much. So we do know that some of these confinement measures are part of the story, but they're not entirely. So it's quite stable over time, again, focusing across G7 countries. The main results on the determinants of remote working, and here we use the estimates of remote working, we find that the higher degree of urban or density, the greater share of remote working, or in other words, the lower density, the lower potential to work remotely. And that is pretty much consistent across all regions from G7 countries. And then we did some modeling. We try to find out what were the main drivers behind remote working. And it comes down to two main drivers. The first one is female participation rate. So the higher the female participation rate, the higher the possibilities to work remotely. And the second one is, of course, access to high quality internet. And this analysis is quite interesting because we do find that the effects are bigger in cities. That is, having more access to digital benefits cities more than rural. But the benefits are also occurring everywhere. Despite the effects are lower on some of the low density, they're still positive. So we think that there's, we'll talk about in the policy recommendations, what other policy areas are needed to increase remote working in places outside of cities. Then the effects on the labor market are quite interesting because we've already seen that remote working already leads to some tangible benefits. We've seen that during the pandemic, those that were working remotely had higher participation on the labor market, less likely to fall under unemployment, earned higher hourly wages, and of course worked longer hours. So those are some of the results that are kind of like self-explanatory, but it's nice to see them confirmed in the data. Then a little bit looking at some of the policy takeaways, we know that it brings a number of benefits, and here we focus first on the well-being. We know that it adds flexibility, and in particular, it adds the possibility for some of the secluded and vulnerable groups, such as elderly women, to play a larger role participating on the labor market. It provides cost savings both for workers and firms. For workers, the lower commuting allows them to spend more time doing other activities or even working, but also relocating to places that have lower cost of living is also a cost savings. For firms, we know that remote working leads to lower costs, operating costs, but also a larger pool of labor inputs. So that means that they can expand the number of workers and the skill sets that they might have, and that's a cost saving from the firm's perspective. In terms of the productivity, although there's still a lot of analysis on trying to look at the net effects on productivity, we do know that at least during the crisis, the productivity hasn't fallen down. So this is like a very interesting area and analyzed area. And we do know that remote working has reduced significantly greenhouse gas emissions over the period of the pandemic. Nevertheless, we do think that it requires support in a number of policy areas. I mentioned before the importance of good access to internet and digital infrastructure. And along with that, a little bit, it's not just having the infrastructure itself, but skills, and investing in digital skills is as equally of important to help some of the workers and citizens to take advantage of this. We also know that there's been a little bit of negative side effects on the ability to network for career development, especially for the young. Being in Zoom meetings doesn't allow them to establish their networks as they would have wished. And there's a number of negative side effects, including spending too much time in front of the computer and having more family and life balance. We heard before a little bit the results of the surveys. These are actually quite interesting. We did a number of 11 of them. For the case of Tokyo, we do see that around 46% of the workers would prefer to live outside of Tokyo if they had the chance to work remotely. What's interesting is that amongst this percentage, which include about 1,078 in the sample, about 42 prefer to have secondary homes, and 31 would like to have a permanent relocation in some of these rural areas. In terms of the firms, the sample that we looked at of 375, about 14% would like to relocate elsewhere. But we also looked at a number of additional surveys, such as in London, and we found that about 15% of workers living in London would prefer to move outside. We looked at another survey in Italy. Workers living in the north, about 85% would prefer to move to the south if they can work remotely. So there's a number of evidence that we know that there's a greater willingness to adopt remote working in a hybrid form. Now, what I think is most fascinating from this study is a little bit the thinking ahead. And here we don't have all the responses, of course, but we looked into the literature. We're very happy that we have a lot of the authors with us today to come up with a number of scenarios. And the scenarios have already been mentioned by our director Lamia before. I'm not going to go into them. And in fact, it's actually 5 scenarios, because the rise of the intermediate cities depends on the location of cities. And I know Phillip Mccain will talk a little bit more. But I think what's interesting on these 4 different possible scenarios is that it'll likely be a combination of these. And I think that policies can play a big role in shaping desirable scenarios. And I think that's an important area that the report tries to do, to be a bit more future looking, more anticipatory, and also be aware of some negative side effects that some of these scenarios might bring, which leads us to a little bit to the policy areas that we've focused on the report. The first set of recommendations that we've highlighted is to facilitate remote working and reduce the digital divides. So here we focus not just on the infrastructure aspect, but also on skills, having a holistic approach, addressing issues such as reducing cultural and legal barriers for remote working. The second one is that we see that there's a lot of things that can be done in terms of the provision of services through digital and remote ways. So we think that can increase with the attractiveness and the quality of life of people where it's much more difficult and costly to provide some of these services. So we looked at a number of those recommendations, including to increase the attractiveness of some of these regions. We also highlighted that it's very important that these policies don't lead to fights, to kind of like we see like short-term actions subsidizing workers and firms, but lead to gain situations. I think that's something quite important that national policymakers should be aware of. And also the third area is also to shaping these environments that are environmentally friendly and sustainable. So we're also trying to, when it comes to changing commuting patterns, making sure that the transportation modes are coordinated, that they don't have any negative side effects, that spatial planning and housing and transportation talk to each other and so forth. So we have a long knowledge within the OECD, but we think that these areas are important to look into when shaping some of these scenarios. So I think this is a bit of a short summary, and I'm sure we'll go into more into depth into the various elements. Back to you, Andres.
Okay, thank you, Enrique. I think that was a good presentation with the key messages. And now we move to the first panel. As Lamia said at the beginning, we have 2 panels in this event, one on private sector and one on academics. This first panel will be on academia, on private sector, as you see, as you know, is an important aspect for the implications of remote working. So we are glad to have with us three important types of firms. One is a real estate commercial firm that is an international firm that can give us some inputs about the trends on office space prices and rentals. A financial firm, we have with us HSBC, and technology firm, IBM. So to start this this panel, I would like to give the floor to Mrs. Evelyn Ravenstein, lead occupier representation in the Netherlands. She's from Cushman & Wakefield, is the commercial real estate company. Please, Evelyn, if you can share your screen.
Yeah, I hope you can see all my screen now. Is that correct?
Yes, perfect.
Perfect. That worked well. That's very nice. Thank you for having me on this panel, Andres, and thank you for your introduction. I would shortly mention something about the company I work for, Cushman & Wakefield. Cushman & Wakefield is a leading global real estate services firm that delivers exceptional value for real estate occupiers and owners. Cushman & Wakefield is among the largest real estate services firms with approximately 50,000 employees in 400 offices and 60 countries. And in 2020, the firm had a revenue of 7.8 billion across core services of property, facilities and project management, leasing, capital markets, valuations, and other services. And we have done some research and delivered some reports lately that provides us a new perspective on COVID-19's effect on the commercial real estate industry and, of course, the future of the office. It's a global impact. We conclude that the structural impacts of work from home trends will be offset by actors such as economic growth, population growth, and office using penetration, which means demands for office will continue to grow over the 10-year forecast horizon. On this slide, you can see the impact per region. Globally, office leasing fundamentals will be significantly damaged in the near term. It's already started, of course. The COVID-19 recession and structural impacts will result in total in 95.8 million square feet of negative net absorption between now and 2021 worldwide. And to compare it with the greater financial crisis, this impact is greater. In that scenario, it was 85 million square feet of negative absorption occurred. Globally, a global office vacancy will rise from 10.9% pre-crisis in 2019 to 15.6% in 2020. And also the global rents are forecast to decline 10.9%, peak through to, well, I think 2022. As the economy and employment recover, the globe's office sector begins absorbing space in begin 2022. And vacancy begins trending downwards from that point forward. Global office vacancy returns to pre-crisis levels of approximately 11% by 2025. So globally, rents bottom in 2022 and begin appreciating from that point forward, returning also in a pre-crisis peak level in 2025. This is also a comparison with the former crisis we have been into, the terms that we are going back to a normal level. These are the numbers that we are facing worldwide, although recovering from the crisis in 2022 and full recovery in 2025, it's important to understand what kind of impact working from home have on the future of the office, because it's not only the economic value, but also that we have changed our way of working. Cushman & Wakefield has carried out one of the largest studies in the world into office use since the COVID-19 outbreak. More than 56,000 respondents, of which 11,000 within the organization itself, were questions about their current and future wishes concerning office use. The preference of diverse generations were studied with regard to their workplace, their wishes concerning office use, and home working and the work-life balance. That's something Lamia also mentioned. The study was carried out at the start of the pandemic and repeated as worldwide lockdowns began to relax. And the two main outcomes of these studies are that employees can be productive anywhere, not only at the office. For some, that was a very eye-opener. And 73% of the respondents named that the flexibility and freedom to decide when and where they work as a specific condition for good employment practice. I will show you this slide where you can see that it depends on the location when it's a little bit higher, but this is what they mentioned when they asked how they will see remote working in the future. And that does not mean that they work completely at home, but a hybrid situation, working from home and in the office. So this means that the function of the office will change permanently. More than a workplace, it will above all become the place where people connect with the organization they work for, the place where they become inspired, where they can learn, collaborate, and socialize. And especially when we see it's also a demographic item. In the current decade, around 700 million baby boomers will retire, and will we see the first 50 years old of Generation X, while the total worldwide population will be dominated by 2 billion people in Generation Z. A 50-year-old millennial may seem a long way off, but this will reality at the end of this decade. The impending demographic changes are complete upheavals and will have a huge effect on the entire real estate market. And that certainly includes the office market.
Employer, 1 minute, you have 1 minute.
Thanks. Employers always in search of top talent will have to stand out for their rivals within highly diverse generations. Because as research shows, it's perfectly possible for all generations to work from home, but it's not what all of them want. During the coming 5 years, users will have to search for a sustainable and technical symbiosis between an optimal office environment and an optimal home working environment. We can conclude that the year 2020 was an unusual one for the office market in all respects. Huge uncertainty surrounding the progress and effect on the COVID pandemic has caused both investors and occupiers to adapt a wait-and-see approach. Major structural changes were already underway in the property market, and these have become apparent more rapidly during the COVID period, as if the fast-forward button has been pressed. One should also consider the future of smaller shopping districts, as well as falling demand for office space in the peripheral municipalities around the major cities caused by online shopping and home working. These past months have acted as a catalyst of accelerator of major long-term structural trends that had already begun. The COVID crisis will further reinforce the preference amongst investors and occupiers. The combination of a central office and a good digital infrastructure enables office staff to work further away from their office workplace because their daily presence at the office will no longer be the norm. As a result, employees will have much greater freedom of choice where they live, how to work, and will be more demanding in that respect, making both the function and location of an office building more relevant. More than over the focus, however, central locations that are easy to reach by car or public transport. And this will increase the pressure also as regards prices on offices that meets that conditions. Thank you for your time and your presence.
Thank you, Evelyn. I think very interesting points. You mentioned the part of the points of generation and probably also demographic change. So I think that is something that we would like to discuss in the Q&A. We have now 92 participants. I mean, if you want to participate, please send us a question through the Q&A function. We will read it and the speakers will try to answer. We saw 100 rise, so I mean, better if you send a question through the chat function. Now we move to another sector. We move to the financial sector. Greg Clark is the group advisor for future cities and new industries from HSBC Bank. HSBC is one of those companies that have announced some changes in the way they are going to work after the pandemic due to an increase in remote working adoption. So please, Greg, the floor is yours.
Great. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for the opportunity to be here. Thank you to the Japanese government and the OECD for organizing this. I'm going to make 7 points. I'm not going to use any slides, and I'm going to try to come in before the allocated 10 minutes. So the first point I want to make is that HSBC is obviously a global financial institution, 63 countries, nearly 250,000 members of staff, present in 300 cities. But 75% of HSBC's client-facing staff are concentrated in just 22 cities around the world. And you can imagine immediately which 22 cities they are, because HSBC as a bank specializes in cross-border investing, cross-border trade finance, cross-border entrepreneurship, and cross-border talent flows. So it tends to be concentrated in the places from which the cross-border activities are produced, and we know them colloquially as world cities or global cities or internationalizing cities. Of the 63 countries that we're in, 7 of them, of course, are the G7 countries, but there's many others, and I'll be reflecting a little bit on non-G7 experience in all of this as well. Now, the second point I want to make is that well before the pandemic, financial services was one of those sectors which was already rapidly embracing digitization, and remote working was already a key part of that. So many bank employees, particularly if they were in a customer-facing role with individual citizen customers, we might call consumers, many of them were adopting practices of working from home, working remotely, not just occasionally, but in some cases permanently, although this was much more slowly being developed in what we might call the business-to-business customers, investment banking, corporate banking, business banking, and everything else, where there was still a premium on face-to-face interaction with clients directly. Now, as a consequence of the pandemic, of course, there's been, I think, a strong focus on how these remote working practices can be accelerated. And as you've already said, Andres, HSBC is reviewing its policies and its deployment here and thinking again about how to achieve that interesting mix of being able to serve the client well, being able to have a better employee experience, and at the same time making some financial savings. And I can't imagine that HSBC is unique in this regard. Like many global financial institutions, this is a sector where a high level of digitization introduced largely by customers through smart devices, of course, is forcing financial institutions to shift to these changes. So the third point to make really is that many financial institutions are now doing a review of these kinds of practices and working, thinking about what is the best balance in the future between office-based work and remote-based work, and also how to use these kinds of policies, not just to save money, but to induce greater creativity and innovation, how to strengthen ecosystems, where to build relationships better with suppliers, opportunities for co-location of different aspects of work that happens within the bank, but also co-location with other kinds of activities. Now, the fourth point is that over the last 18 months, I've spent a lot of time talking with the bank's 4,500 business customers, many of whom are very large customers. And we've been talking, of course, with them about the pandemic, the implication it's going to have on their working practices. And I want to make 8 very quick points about what's come out of that conversation. Now, the first thing to say is that these are conversations with clients from a multiplicity of sectors. We're not just talking about financial services here, we're also talking about a broad spectrum of professional services, creative and media activities, IT companies, many companies involved in trade, logistics, shipping, and other things, as well as companies that are based in consumer services, travel, tourism, real estate, utilities, infrastructure, and so much more. Now, I think the first key point to make is that for many of these companies, we're still at the very early stages of finding what this process of change is going to be. Many companies are still in phase one of what will be a three-phase process, where as they come out of a kind of a constrained situation or a lockdown, there will be a recovery, as it were, and a reformulating phase. And then there'll be a third phase, which we could call the reset. It's rather obvious, I think, that there are dangers in extrapolating from what happens during the pandemic management phase about what will be the shape or the behavior in the recovery phase and in the reset phase. And it's very important to do that kind of prospective thinking that this report outlines in order to begin to think more detail about that. The second point to make here is that there seem to be rather different things happening in different parts of the world at different times. We've been tracking what's happening in 50 cities around the world. And of course, at various points in the year, the color coding of who's in red, amber, and green from the point of view of pandemic management has shifted around the world, literally in waves, as we saw Beijing, Shanghai, Hong Kong, Singapore, and others recover between the first and second phase. We saw people getting back to 80 to 90% levels of office repatronage. We saw 85% levels of public transport uses, only to see some of those numbers drop again as certain countries went back into some kind of lockdown scenario. What I would say, though, is that looking at the places that have sustained, as it were, a period outside of restrictive practices, the return to a business as usual has been much higher than people expected in most cases. And I think that's interesting and important. Now, the other thing to say, and this is the third point in this, is that the nature of the containment policies that are used in countries have been, of course, very different. To put it at its most simple, some countries have closed their national borders, whereas others have really reduced what their population is able to do, depending upon levels of infection. And that seems to be influencing patterns of thought, both about remote working and about return to the office. And we can then identify a series of other important variables, like the sector mix, the debate about the future of the office. In many countries, we begin to see from the clients a conversation about the diminishing returns of remote working and the importance of getting back to the office for the point of view of creativity, confidentiality, brand building, staff training, many other things. And indeed, it's a favorite dinner party conversation. What is the use of the office? And people are surprised at how many interesting things they find for the office. And particularly, there's concern in many advanced sectors about these diminishing returns from remote working practices. I think also what's become clear is that the degree of urbanization in any nation seems to matter. The nations where there's an 80% urbanization rate seem to be the ones where there's most appetite to embrace remote working, whereas the nations that are 30, 40, 50, 60% urbanizing and still acquiring, as it were, the benefits of urbanization and its impact on productivity, there seems to be a much stronger return to the office and a return to a business as usual model quite quickly. And then perhaps two final points to make on this. Population flows are clearly affecting the way we discuss and debate this. It's rather obvious, is it not, that during a pandemic, 1/2 of the normal population flow occurs, which is that people are continuously leaving cities to move to areas further away from the city once they're established in their career. In any normal year, that's offset by international migrants who move into the city to start their career. During the pandemic, we've seen 1/2 of this process, but not the other half. And people are expecting, I think, quite a big correction on population flows. And then lastly, of course, it depends a lot, not just on the sector composition of the economy and, as it were, the propensity for remote working, which varies by sector, but also the propensity for remote working by function. One of the things we noticed is that, for example, in headquarter functions, R&D functions, marketing functions, there's less of an intention for remote working, much more likely, excuse me, in sales, IT, processing and service functions. So it depends again on the functions that are being undertaken there. So that's really point 5. What have been the insights from that? Point 6, what does it mean for place-based policies? I can't tell the OECD anything about that. Simply to say there's clearly a big implication in all of this for urban policies, particularly policies that enable cities to adjust to a new demand profile and to service new kinds of demand as old kinds of demand moves away. And a lot of that is about land use planning policies, I would argue. There's clearly policies for broader territorial areas, coastal, remote, rural areas, where there's a big opportunity for them to align with opportunities to increase population and their job space. And that has big implications, of course, for connectivity.
If you can start to wrap up, please.
Sorry?
You can start finishing up, please.
Sure. Many implications for mobility policies, of course, and I don't need to tell you what all of them are, as well as all of these digital policies. But I think finally the thing I would say is that all of this raises very important issues for social, environmental and health policies as well, which are worth thinking about. And it seems to me that the big conclusion from all of this is that there's going to be a leadership imperative for how cities, regions, rural areas and suburban areas chart their path into the future. And I think many important issues here about public and private collaboration on re-engineering place-based policies after the pandemic. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Greg. I think that you mentioned some of these points on the difference among occupations to use and to really adopt remote working. And I think our next speaker is going to talk more about this, David Burns, Vice President of Global Workforce Policy at IBM. IBM, a company that for several years had already adopted remote working. And we would like to hear from you, what is the new changes that you see after the pandemic for your working culture and how you see the future on these trends. David, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Andres, and special thanks to Nakahara-san and the Japanese Ministry of Land, Infrastructure, Transport and Tourism, and the OECD, of course. IBM is a company of some 330,000 employees. We're an artificial intelligence and hybrid cloud technology company, and we do business in about 170 countries around the world. So like HSBC, where we have a global footprint. Let me start by saying that, perhaps not since the Industrial Revolution have leaders had to think so hard about work design. Because look, all around us, we can see a lot of people talking, taking sides about where people will work, what should happen, what will happen. It's what we're talking about today. But employers really need to be careful that an undue focus on where work gets done will cause the critical issue of how work gets done to be given insufficient attention. The way we see it, our priority challenge is to try and deconstruct and examine all our processes and activities to find the optimal way to work and to get things done. And we really need to be careful with time horizons as an employer in giving that consideration, because as we found during the pandemic, what can work and be attractive for the shorter term may in fact be corrosive to performance and to employee engagement and over a longer time horizon for very human and social reasons. And of course, not every employee is going to have a perfect home working environment, particularly in high density cities like Tokyo and New York. So going forward, we want to be selective and apply the best of what we learned. Because when we discuss these so-called hybrid work models, we quickly discover that the word hybrid means many different things to many different people, both employers and employees. So what IBM has decided is that rather than discussing specific or debating specific hybrid work models, we will continue our focus on flexibility, because specifics are going to be dictated by the specifics of job roles, by the objectives of business units, and by the team, and by the dynamism of workflow. So our thinking and practices will continue to evolve with experience. And because the transitions from our pandemic model of 95% of our employees being remote are going to be complicated for individual employees by things like childcare, by public transport systems, and by other location-specific complications or conditions, associated with the pandemic. So we want to be flexible. We want to combine the best of pre-pandemic practice with the best of virtual remote environment of the last year or so. And so we're asking our leaders and our managers to set expectations that liberate employees from their typical work day. They're being asked to focus on work practices like meeting quality and not meeting quantity. For IBM, this is going to be an evolution rather than a revolution. Pre-pandemic, 80% of our global workforce was primarily in the office on most days of the week, but not all days. But at the same time, 95% already worked remotely as needed under our flexible working policies. And indeed, IBM has been a pioneer in remote working over recent decades. And for us, working hours flexibility has been and continues to be foundational to our inclusive culture. So going forward, what do we see? Most employees will continue to work in a flexible model, on-site and remotely. Our employees will need to live within a commutable distance of an IBM location to effectively team and to encourage innovation. Based on job roles, we expect some 80% of our 330,000 employees to adopt that flexible model, with the majority of them in the office at least 3 days a week or some part of those days. Between 10 and 20% may be entirely remote based on their occupations, their job roles. And around 5% will always be on site, again, because of job specifics. Now, how often those flexible employees are in the workplace, well, that's the 80%, will be based on the work outcome that their business unit and their team will need to deliver, and on their particular job roles and responsibilities. The focus in consideration of presence will very much will be based on the outcomes. So what will that mean for our geographic physical footprint? Well, we have over 70 million square feet of office space across the world, mainly offices and data centers, as you'd expect. At the moment, we are closing many underutilized locations, but that process started back before the pandemic. It is not pandemic driven, but we have accelerated the process. Because as a large company, a large employer, you tend to acquire office locations when you make acquisitions of other businesses, for example, which may not be that far from a pre-existing site that you already lease. Other sites may be underutilized because the profile of the workers there has changed over time. And the majority, for example, may now be technology consultants or salespeople who are mostly out with clients and rarely come into the office anyway. At the end of that process, we will be retaining over half our existing footprint, but with the space, the office space, purposefully reconfigured for teaming and for collaboration. Those spaces will feature many more varieties of workspaces to reflect more agile and varied working requirements. The closure of some of those existing locations will obviously free up funds for those changes and improvements. But we are going to continue to be committed to global capitals such as New York, London, Toronto, etc., where our largest clients continue to invest. The availability of suitable talent pools is also highly influential on physical location decisions, because this isn't just about where existing employees are located, but from where we will hire our future employees. Also critical, obviously, is the role of government policy. In some countries, there are, in fact, labor rules and other policies that restrict or even prohibit remote work or work from home arrangements. And so those jurisdictions are going to have to reconsider those rules in the light of changing work practices.
David.
Yep, so you can draw your own conclusion about how that outlook aligns with the scenarios sketched in the OECD's very good report. But again, for IBM, flexibility and focus on outcomes will be the key underpinnings of our approach going forward. Thanks.
Excellent. Very good points, David. I think there are some questions already in the chat. So I think there are some for you, some for Greg, and some for Evelyn. Now we move just for a concluding remarks of this panel, and then we can open the floor for some answers from the speakers. We move to the government side. So now we have with us Judith Winternitz, Director, Regional Policy and Recovery Branch from the Department of Infrastructure, Transport, Regional Development and Communications of Australia. Judith, tell us, what do you think about the discussion? And if you have any question for the speakers, please, you can start the discussion also.
Thank you very much. I hope you can hear me.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you so much. It was a fascinating discussion and has brought many things to the fore that we are experiencing from a government perspective in Australia. One of the great questions in Australia is the recovery from COVID, because the effects of COVID have not been as massive in Australia health-wise as has been in many other parts of the world due to our ability to close our borders. But that has not necessarily lessened the effect in terms of working environment and working patterns. Governments too, I believe, have experienced very much the reference that has been made to the emphasis on hybrid work and hybrid work experience, which has then also led to a question about, in Australia, and I'm sure in many other countries, and OECD discussions in some of the working groups have talked about this, the effects on remote working on the ability of employees, government employees also, to work outside their normal patterns and also outside their normal places. I was particularly taken by the idea of the different generations and the different generations of workers and their expectations of what work means and their need to collaborate at certain points of time. It's been obvious in Australia with COVID recovery, which has been quite strong in Australia post-COVID. The business life and economic effects have rebounded quite strongly. But it's been obvious that there is a distinct pattern of wishing to maintain some aspects of the hybrid work that has been forced on us by COVID, so that even government agencies are now allowing workers to work much more from home and have this hybrid pattern of 2 or 3 days at home and 2 or 3 days in the workplace. That is very common. And also the need for the younger people, particularly millennials and Generation Z, as has been referenced, their need to see the workplace in a different way, so that it's not just a place that you go to do everyday things, it's a place that you go to collaborate and to check out with other people some of the ideas that you've developed possibly at home. So I was particularly taken with that, and I think governments are moving strong in that direction. Australian government has been active in allowing and supporting this hybrid work, and in fact has been supporting it in a number of ways, including in some aspects of early tax policy. So I think some of the discussion is very strong and has been very helpful for me to clarify some of the things that are happening in Australia. We also finally agree with you that we're not sure, even in Australia, which has had a very much stronger recovery pattern because of the ability to control the health impacts, we're not sure the extent to which remote working will remain a very strong kind of desire. People are finding some of the downsides of remote working for an extended period of time. They're finding the isolation a little bit difficult. They're finding also the ability of remote work in that way to incur a great deal of cost personally, in that you are kind of almost 24-hour available for work when you're at home. And it's difficult sometimes to tear yourself away, even if you have family responsibilities around you, but work is always there and it's always possible to do. So the separation of a day between work and non-work is not as strong when you are working constantly at home. And I'm sure that that effect has been felt particularly by women who are struggling to maintain a number of roles. Thank you for the discussion. I think it's been very fruitful so far.
Perfect. Thank you, Judith. So I think, well, we are gonna go over and probably not take this break. And so I hope that is okay for you. Probably it's most valuable to discuss some of these questions that we have in the chat. So let's go 5 minutes more. If the speakers can take 2 minutes each to answer the question, is a bit tight, but we are sure that you can do it. For Evelyn, the first question is, have you identified, or well, in your company, a different trend on office prices or rentals among large cities and small cities?
Yeah, but even before COVID, there was a shift going on from the various organizations from the periphery to the centers of the larger cities, due to good accessibility to public transport. The war of talent was also already before COVID a hot item. And of course, also the quality of the buildings in those centers and the facilities they can offer. And we expect that this trend will continue, with the result that the rents will increase in these centers and decrease in the periphery.
So the trend the other way around, you haven't found like companies or prices in the small cities growing more than in capitals in large cities?
No, the other way around. The larger companies still want to move to these city centers. They still want to have the best locations, because the people don't come that often to work anymore. So they want to have one extra gimmick to come. So larger cities is more to happen. They can combine work with pleasure. So it's easier to attract people and to make sure that you can show what your culture is. That's always difficult to show people your culture in smaller cities. So this was already a trend, but it's I think the COVID fastened this trend a little bit more. In Europe, I don't know in the rest of the world, but in Europe we see that for housing, it's directly the opposite. The residentials, people are more willing to evacuate to the smaller cities. So the prices in the smaller cities are rising for residentials, and decrease just a little bit because the prices are extremely high at the moment, of course. So that's the opposite, because they don't go for 5 days a week to their work, but only 2 or 3. So distance to the work does not matter anymore, and they want to choose more quality of living with more space, more green. So they move from the city center to the smaller cities. But the offices, I still am convinced that they will go to the city centers. That's the main important issue.
Thank you. And I think, well, there is a discussion there. So I think I see Nicholas Bloom already connected. So probably we can discuss this in the next panel. For Greg Clark, in 2 minutes, Greg, if you can do it, despite the discussion about change coming, is there a reason you see such a large proportion of your clients returning to normal? The question talks about diminishing returns, still implies a lot of more change in theory than you mentioned.
Sure, and I think Evelyn has just described one of the reasons that's the case. So if you think of it this way, that what an increased element of remote working as part of a flexible or hybrid working pattern allows is for people to live further away from the work and to not have to visit the office every day of every week in just the way that was described brilliantly by David. But one of the consequences of that is that it actually creates more capacity in the cities for the hosting of jobs. So the consequence is quite possibly that you have a larger number of jobs hosted in the cities because they have effectively a larger housing market that is able to support their labor force. So you can have both a redistribution of population to smaller cities and towns and a reconcentration of job locations in the city center. That's entirely possible under a hybrid condition where there's more remote and flexible working. Now, I said in my remarks, and I stand by it, that I think there are some big variables here. Those are variables by sector, by function, and I think by location. And so I expect to see a different pattern in every part of the world. But what I did not say is that there will be no change. There's going to be a huge amount of change, and our offices will change, the way that we work will change, the way we interact with each other and our clients will change. But that may not mean that we're going to abandon our business districts and our office clusters to all go for a remote working solution. It means that flexible working creates new opportunities both for city centers and business districts and also for residential areas, for suburbs, but also for smaller cities and towns. And that requires some active strategies to make the most of them. So I expect to see the majority of our clients in the business to business sectors continuing to use offices, but those offices will be different, but they will be in city centers where the branding, the amenities, the talent, the clients, the suppliers are available in a large scale, but they will also take advantage of their workers having access to cheaper housing markets, and they will use flexible working to enable them to do that.
Thank you, Eric. Yeah, so more attractive offices, probably empty buildings converted to housing, so that will ease housing availability. Some thoughts that are interesting too. The last one, and we close probably with that one, is for David. Are you expecting to set up more IBM locations? Probably a strategy of downscaling the big headquarters and putting small scattered offices across the territory?
On the contrary, actually, Andres, as Evelyn and Greg both more than ably described, big cities or city centers have a strong attraction, not the least because that's where the majority of our clients are located. I mentioned the other consideration, of course, being the talent pool, and where are those talent pools, which is so important for the technology sector. I did discuss the fact that we are reducing our physical footprint because we have many hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of sites all around the world. And it's the small locations that essentially are most often unsustainable because you need to bring teams from across the different functions of work, as Greg described, together for teaming, innovation, and so on, because it's at the edge of corporate functions where innovation happens, at that intersection. So we are more in a process of consolidating and reducing the number of sites rather than looking to put new footprints out there, which may be small and really of dubious economy. I think perhaps, Evelyn will know more about this, but perhaps the companies that are, selling short-term office space, like the WeWork and so on to the world, maybe they'll fill some of that need. I don't know if there is a demand for it.
Okay, excellent. I think about we are short on time, but I think there were more questions I see that I got directly, but we can probably see if after the second panel there is some time. I see also one delegate to the Working Party of Rural Policy to the OECD, Sabrina, that is raising the hand. Sabrina, we will try to give you the floor if you want to make some question after the second panel.
Yes, you can take 5 more minutes. We're still waiting on Philippe.
Okay, so I will probably just, I have one question. It's about what are the factors that will attract, especially, for example, some offices, for example, for Greg or for Evelyn, to rural areas. What they will need to have in place to attract these new firms, for example, these working spaces, or what do you think that is required apart from, of course, speed broadband? And I will give the floor to Sabrina. I don't know if Evelyn, Greg, you want to tell us.
Evelyn, if you'd like to, otherwise I'll say something.
No, you go first.
Well, I think there are 2 scenarios in which rural areas can attract offices from this, but both of them have to be underpinned by very high quality of life and good physical connectivity to the major centers, not just good digital connectivity. And I would say one of them is extreme specialization, that they have the ability to acquire and host a particular R&D function that builds upon some unique territorial asset or advantage that they have. Or secondly, a high level of flexibility. So the co-working spaces in an environment where people can work close to home, but not necessarily at home. And that kind of model can work in a destination that is very well connected, I would suggest.
Yeah, to add to Greg, and most of the time it's not only the co-working, but it's combined with the other larger office in the city center. So it's most of the time a combination, and especially when you want as a employee to gain the people to your location, well, it's difficult if you already also include some flexible spaces. Of course, that's especially in the Netherlands, because the distances aren't that far, so that's much more easier to say. But I think it's a combination of the two. Your former office, where you can have your culture, where you can connect, combine, and some extra workplaces for your employees so that they can work or at home or at the office nearby.
Okay, thank you. Sabrina, can you talk? Are you? I think you are available to talk.
Honestly, I don't want to intervene. I'm sorry. I think it was a mistake.
Okay, great. So, I mean, if you want, you can. So we can take the second panel. So, well, no, thank you, everyone. I think there are still some uncertainties. I see some mixed picture for some occupations, for some industries, but I think there is already like a target and a way to move forward, and especially for policymakers. That is the important part, David, you mentioned, making the rules to allow remote working, making these rules work. Probably the physical infrastructure and the ICT also is important, the connections that you mentioned, Greg. So, well, no, thank you, and we will move to the next panel. This is the academic panel. I will give the moderation to Michelle, and thank you, Ola.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Andres. I'm so pleased to be here today. My name is Michelle Marshalian, and I'll be moderating this panel. I'm here today to open and welcome a brilliant panel of academic experts whose research has contributed to the 4 scenarios for the new normal that is discussed in this report. So if we can have Celia just pin our panel members up while I'm talking, that would be great. So in the previous panel, we've heard from HSBC on high-skilled finance sector trends across the world, where there's a model of firm management where we have an increasing remote working as a norm. This, for example, may suggest an alignment with one of the theories we elaborated in the report, that of the city paradox. So then we heard from also IBM with years of experience in remote work that is now encouraging a more flexible work from home model in an already relatively high work from home culture, the IT culture, while furthermore implementing a 45-minute drive rule. This suggests something similar to the donut effect that we will also hear about today. And as in other tech firms, we see that there is this split in occupations that are involved in the innovation process that maybe might divide how employers are deciding to bring people back to work. So finally, we also heard from a real estate company that is planning for a different variation in the way in which the demands are being for office spaces being observed across territories. So we see that there have been several different manifestations of some of the theories that we have in the report that have been discussed in the private sector panel. And so each one of these private sector examples maps into the scenarios we have elaborated in the report. So we now have the great luck and opportunity to welcome the following panelists that are authors of research tied to each one of these scenarios. For time's sake, I'm going to introduce everyone right now, and then I will help transition forward. So first, we have Professor Nicholas Bloom, Professor of Economics at Stanford University. He is the co-director of the Productivity Innovation Entrepreneurship Program at the NBER, and does lots of research that focuses on measuring and explaining management practices across firms and countries. He is invited here today because he is one of the authors of the paper entitled The Donut Effect of COVID-19 on Cities. His research not only makes us hungry, but also captures one of the 4 scenarios we described in the report. So we thank you in particular for joining us at 6 a.m. from the Californian coast. Next, we have Fabian Eckert, who is a professor in the Department of Economics at the University of California, San Diego. His research includes trade, economic geography, and macroeconomics, with recent work on the return to big cities and education policies in spatial general equilibrium models. So he has been invited here today because he is one of the authors of the paper on the city paradox, a paper focusing on remote working trends, skills, and the paradox of interconnected systems of occupation and skills. He is not joining us today from sunny California, but rather New York. So lastly, we welcome Phillip Mccain, who, congratulations, just went through a PhD panel. He is a professor of urban and regional economics at the University of Sheffield, and an honorary professor of economic geography at the University of Groningen. He is a co-director of the Productivity Insights Network and co-investigator at the Productivity Institute. His research and textbooks have informed economic geographers over the past decade. So he is invited here today for his reflections on the rise of intermediate cities, and he is joining us today from potentially rainy Sheffield. So I welcome everyone, and with this short introduction, please, Nick, take the stage.
Great. Hey, thanks very much, Michelle. I don't know if you can hear I'm actually British, but I am in California. It's still dark when I got up, so I'm sorry. I didn't get the first hour. I was like, my alarm clock start with a 5 number, which is always a scary thing. So I'll just share my screen. I have a few slides. It's fascinating. I caught the last half an hour. It's pretty fascinating, actually. It's hugely related. So why don't I share my screen? Here we go. So you can see this? Great. Okay, so I'm going to talk about the donut effect. This is joint work with Arjun Ramani, who is unbelievably, he's an undergrad actually at Stanford. I don't think I've ever written a paper before with an undergrad. So this shows data. To back up, what do? We get data from 2 sources. One is Zillow, which is a US property price company. I've been in America so long, I'm not quite sure which companies operate internationally, but in the US, Zillow is one of the big property price companies, have it by zip code, by month. And the other source of data I'm going to talk about is from the United States Postal Service. So in the US, every time you move, you have to send the USPS a change of address request. And we got from a Freedom of Information Act, the net flows by zip code. So what you're looking at here is migration patterns of individuals. So that shows net population flows. So we're taking inward flows minus outward flows. and it's cumulative from February 2020, just before the pandemic, to February 2021. And it's as a zip code level. And what you can see on the left and on the right is, what we call the donut effect in the paper. It's pretty clear. And in fact, the media has been, I know this is heavily in the OECD report we heard about in the last discussion. I've seen it here. I'm going to show you about the US. I've seen data for the UK. It was interesting, the discussion earlier about commercial companies moving to the center of cities. Here we're looking at population. So just to describe in detail, on the left is for New York. What you can see is during the pandemic, people left Manhattan. They left Jersey City on the west side of Manhattan. They left Brooklyn on the right side, and they moved out to the suburbs. On the right, you can see for San Francisco, where I live is somewhere down here. I live basically here in one of the areas that's kind of net neutral, but people left the center of San Francisco. This is here is Oakland and Berkeley. So these are the downtown areas, center of the city, and they moved out to East Bay, South Bay, North Bay, etc. So in both cases, there's a net migration out. As we heard earlier, why is this happening? It's pretty straightforward. It's happening because there's been a huge move to hybrid work. So right now, obviously, people are working from home, but in the longer run, certainly in the US, and I think internationally, there's been an enormous shift to hybrid. So I've actually been working primarily on working from home. I got into the property market effect because it was really a spin-off of this, but you see in the US that something like 80% of companies now are talking about hybrid. So post-pandemic, the plan is for employees to work in the office 3 days a week, work from home 2 days a week. If that's the case, you obviously don't need to commute as much, and you also want a bit more space to have a home office. And so, it's not very surprising in that sense that there's been a massive movement out of population. So, I'm not showing you business data here, but this is population data. As discussed earlier, people are moving out of city centers. Here's one way to look at it on the left, and then for businesses on the right, which is to is to look at monthly flows. And we broke it down for the 12 largest US cities. So this kind of goes from New York, LA, Washington, San Francisco, Phoenix, etc. And what you see here is before we've normalized it to the February 2020 flows. Before the pandemic, it was pretty flat in terms of trends. There wasn't a big change. Suddenly, of course, the pandemic happens. There's a massive movement out of central business districts. So these are like the cores of big cities. These are not very big areas. So there's much more low density areas. There's a huge move out of the central business district, much of it into lower density areas, some of it into, not much, but some into other smaller cities. So this is population on the left. The center of the biggest 12 American cities have lost about 15% cumulatively of their population, which is a massive drop. On the right is businesses. So the Postal Service data also reports business flows. Similar story, about 15% of business addresses have moved out of business, postal addresses have moved out of establishments since the beginning of the pandemic. It was very interesting hearing the discussion earlier, which is claiming that, particularly, I've forgotten, Evelyn from Cushman Wakeman, she was claiming, and Greg, that actually businesses are moving in. It's hard to tell. Here, we see the net count of businesses moving out. It's worth remembering most businesses in the US, as in Europe, are small. So small businesses, sandwich shops, dentists, little stores, etc., are moving out on average. It's possible that massive multinationals are moving in. IBM may be moving in, HSBC, but in the US, we've seen cumulatively about 15% of business activity moving out city centers. What about real estate? Real estate markets show a very similar trend. On the left is rental rates. On the right is home values. So if you look at rents absolutely collapsed in center of cities. So I know San Francisco is even more extreme than this. I know in San Francisco, rents were down about 30% during the pandemic. It was like back to 2010. San Francisco is about the most expensive city in the world now, I think, because of the tech bubble. But it wasn't last year. You notice where rents have gone up a lot is medium and low density. So everyone fled from city centers, moved out to the suburbs, same in New York, same in other US cities. Is this permanent? Well, this is property prices. So you think it's like to be a more permanent change. That was the question on the change of address. It could be people are temporarily moving out. It doesn't look like it. On the right, you see that the prices of this, again, is residential property in city centers is actually down slightly. high, medium, and low density is massively up. Now, of course, all property prices on average have been rising because the very low interest rates, but city centers actually have fallen a bit. So again, we see strong evidence for residential property rentals on the left and residential property prices on the right. I haven't shown you anything on commercial property, so business property in the US. I've shown you on business flows, they've moved out the center. I don't have any numbers on property prices, primarily because the property market has been pretty dead. So the Zillow data is hard to read. It's very noisy, and there's a huge selection problem. So happy to go to the Q&A. I think it's, my sense is probably even residential, commercial property in city centers is likely done badly. The stories I've heard is on, skyscrapers being very hard to sell. So I should end by saying the donut effect in the US appears to be a large city phenomena. So here is the top 12 US cities. So these are all the big cities that you've heard about, and you see, I know people tend to visit, or you see on, TV from, San Francisco, New York, Washington, LA, Phoenix, etc., Dallas. Here's middle cities, places like Kansas City. They're kind of reasonably big, but they're not massive. And here's the remaining 365 what are called cities in the US, although honestly, a lot of these you call towns. What we see is, for the largest 12 US cities, a huge collapse in, this is migration. So a huge collapse in, populations in the center, smaller out in the, in the high density, and rises in the periphery. You see that a bit in medium-sized cities. These are still pretty big. These are kind of 1 million person, 500,000 person cities. We don't see anything in small places. So this donut effect in the US is primarily a large city phenomena. Interestingly, I'm not going to show you a chart. It doesn't look like people are moving out of large cities to tiny cities. They're not moving from, say, San Francisco to Topeka, Kansas, or Alaska, or Hawaii, or anywhere else. They're moving from the center of large cities to the edges. And so here again, the motivation is, if I say work for, I don't know, Facebook or JP Morgan or whatever employer is in a big US city, I've been told I have to work from home. I can work from home 2 days a week, but I have to come into the office 3 days a week. So I can't move to Hawaii. What I can do is move out to the suburbs. So, I'll stop there, but the donut effect we see is in big cities, people and businesses moving out from the center out to the suburbs. It completely makes sense if you think that the future is hybrid work, which from my other work seems almost, it's not 100%, but I'd say about 80% of businesses are talking about hybrid work.
Okay, well, thanks so much for, thanks so much for that, Nick. We did also find something similar in our mobility analysis, so it's really good to see that our findings are quite aligned here. I'm going to pass the floor off to Fabian. Go ahead.
Hi there, can you hear me?
Yes.
Perfect. Oh, I accidentally crossed out one of my co-authors here just now. I'm presenting, work that we've done called the City Paradox with a bunch of co-authors from various universities. And let me just get in. I'm going to show like 3 graphs similar to Nick. So the key observation that we make in this paper is actually one about what happened already before the pandemic, which is that big cities in the United States have increasingly specialized in types of jobs and industries that can be turned into remote work jobs. Okay, and one way to see that is here on the left, where we use census data before the pandemic and an occupation-based measure on remote work potential. Okay, to compute the fraction of jobs in each US city or commuting zone, if you want, that could be done remotely. Okay, what you see on the left is that there's a really striking trend. The bigger or denser a city or commuting zone, the larger the fraction of the local workforce that could really be working remotely. Another way of seeing that's even more striking is to look at the fraction of the total local wages that are being paid out that goes to workers that could be really working from somewhere else or could be working remotely, and that line's even steeper. So, both of these graphs make the same point, which is that big cities in the US pre-pandemic were strikingly specialized in jobs that could really be done remotely. The comparison between the graphs also highlights the fact that the right one is more steep, also implies that remote work jobs are on average very high income jobs. And in fact, when we kind of drill down into the industry composition, it's really due to this gradient, or this positive relationship between remote work potential and city size is really due to big cities' specialization in information industries, in headquarters, and professional services, and in finance. Okay. Good. Now, just looking at these two graphs, one clear takeaway is that big cities are going to be the most affected by a transition to remote work. Right? They have the largest fraction of their workforce that may or may not be relocating, maybe potentially leaving the cities. Now, what's the paradox? The paradox is that, of course, big cities are also the most expensive places, often by a lot, to live, right? And so, in some sense, it's paradoxical that it's precisely those locations where life is extremely expensive, where rents are very high, where childcare costs are high, where all sorts of local services are very expensive, in which most of the workforce wouldn't really need to be there, right, in order to do their work. And so, we think on the back of these graphs, which again were like pre-pandemic remote work potential graphs, right? On the back of these two graphs, we think that as remote work becomes more technologically possible, so socially acceptable, big cities are going to be very much affected and may run the risk of losing large shares of their local workforce, in particular high-income workers. Now, the paper, we highlight kind of a second important implication of that, which I think often goes unnoticed, which is that these city economies, especially the US, are interesting in the sense that they really consist of these high-skilled service workers, which are driving this remote work specialization, and then a large consumer service economies, i.e. low-skilled workers, working in opera houses and restaurants and providing all these local services that crucially rely on the spending of these high-income individuals. And so the risk that we are highlighting in our paper is really that once these high-income workers either permanently relocate to other locations, or maybe spend half their week somewhere else, that also endangers the income streams for these low-skilled consumer service economies in big cities. And so in that way, big cities really run, in our view, a double risk. Not just of losing the high-income, high-skilled service workers, but also losing the more low-skilled consumer service economies that these high-income workers currently or pre-pandemic were supporting. And so what we do in the rest of the project, and I'm not going to show a lot of detail. What we do in the rest of the project is effectively show that during the pandemic, this mechanism of high-income workers transitioning to remote work, and specifically in big cities, and low-income consumer service workers being hurt as a result and seeing kind of their livelihood endangered, is precisely what happened during the pandemic. And that's what we're kind of showing a variety of data sources in the rest of the paper. I'm just going to show two more slides on that before I'm ending. And so first, once COVID arrives and everyone starts working from, many people start working from home, the remote work potential of big cities gets translated into actual remote work, okay? And so on the left-hand side, this is no longer remote work potential, but it's the actual fraction of a commuting zone's workforce that is working from home. And you see exactly this gradient in remote work, where big cities that are on the right here on this graph, the big cities are the ones that have the largest remote work shares, and that holds true throughout the pandemic, and that's still true in January 2021, which is our latest data point. And looking at the industry composition, it's very much as predicted. It's of course these finance, professional services, headquarter services, and information industries that are driving this trend, in which almost twice as much as in the other average US industry, or workers are working from home or working remotely in those industries. And that's of course what's driving this trend, because these red industries are the ones that are concentrated in big cities. Okay. Now, as Nick showed, and as other panelists have shown before, these high-skill, high-income workers, they are not just staying in cities. And in the paper we show that they are obviously leaving cities, and you see negative net population growth in big cities that is driven by these high-income workers leaving. We don't know whether it's temporary or not. So far, they haven't returned en masse. Okay, Now,
Can you wrap up? Can you wrap up?
I have 1 minute left, right? Okay, and so we see these high-income workers leaving big cities, and you know, the last graph I'm going to show you is that what is really striking is that you see the impact that high-income workers leaving big cities has on low-skilled workers. This solid line here is the decline in hours worked by low-skilled consumer service workers in big cities. And if you compare that to low-skilled service workers in small cities, you see that decline for these low-skilled service workers in big cities is much larger than it was for low-skilled service workers in smaller cities. And throughout the recovery period, you see that this gap between low-skilled workers in small cities and in big cities has remained. And that's due to high-skilled workers having, at least for now, permanently left big cities and taking with them their consumer services demand. And so we think, you know, to conclude, we think that you know, people focusing just on what high-skilled workers are doing, maybe neglecting the impact and dependence of consumer service and urban consumer service economies on high-skilled worker demand. And so cities may be more at risk than we think as a result.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Philip. Go ahead. Sorry, I will share screen for your. Oh well. Celia, my share screening option has been turned off. Okay. Well, Philip.
You want me to share screen? I can,
yeah.
see if I can. I can see if I can do it. I haven't set myself up for it.
That's what happens when you check that everybody else has access. Thanks, Philip.
I can do it. Can you see that?
Yes, you can make it full screen and
yeah.
You'll be ready to go. Go ahead.
One second, sorry. I can see what I'm doing. Okay, can you see that, Michelle? Is that okay?
Yeah, if you can just make it full screen and we can go.
Yeah, here we go.
Perfect.
Okay, sorry about that.
Sorry about it on my side. Go ahead.
Okay, so my observations are very much looking at the situation from here, from the UK, from European countries, where of course the economic geography is very different to the US. I mean, US cities and US city regions are generally, by European standards, tend to have very, very large distances between them. So there's very large intervening areas of primarily rural, primary agricultural land, whereas many parts of Europe, that's not the case. So a lot of the hinterlands of cities in the UK actually rub up against each other. You've got very narrow strips of land, in many cases, sometimes occupied by small towns, sometimes by rural and nothing else. But so just think about what's happened. I mean, obviously the initial shocks of the coronavirus tended to be very much on not only cities, but actually the geography was actually towards the prosperous cities, places like Paris, London, Madrid, Milan, and so on. Those are the early shocks, but those then have dissipated much more spatially, so that the rest of the regions in hinterlands and also less prosperous areas, the effects in terms of the health shocks tended to even out pretty much. And that was something similar to the 2008 crisis as well. Obviously, the source of the crisis was different, but there are similar patterns there. I mean, clearly there's going to be some reduction of commuting, and I mean, certainly the work of both Nick and Fabian, the papers they've been publishing are terrific pieces of work, and the evidence on this is emerging in many, many countries. The problem is we don't really know. We've got a sense of what's happening in the next, let's say, next month and the next year or so, but beyond that, the medium and the long term, there's a lot of uncertainty, and real estate investors and financiers themselves are not clear on what's going to happen. So if you think about the very high value activities that really are dependent on tacit knowledge, which really are the foundation of prosperous city centers, it's very hard to see how a lot of those tacit knowledge-based functions will basically be driven by working from home conditions, which is exactly why, companies are requiring workers at least to have connections with the office. But even if you look at, say, the big consulting firms in Europe, some of them are saying that people can work from home all the time, even people doing due diligence work, whereas others in the same industry are actually forcing people back 4 or 5 days a week. There's a great deal of uncertainty. So particularly how to handle those high value activities that really depend on tacit knowledge. There's a lot of uncertainty there, and investors themselves are not clear. But the likelihood is because of the patterns of economic geography anyway, in terms of human capital, skills, sectoral structures, and so on, different levels of connectivity, there will be differences spatially anyway in terms of resilience to these shocks and the ability of places to adapt. One of the issues here that we don't understand is the level of sorting and restructuring. I mean, there are clearly big real estate shocks happening at the moment in city centres because of the kind of vacancy problems that Nick was jhighlighting. But at the same time, there's also a huge surge of investors back into those markets who are basically bottom feeding. They're seeing this as, junk bond opportunities and what were really prime real estate markets. So there's a lot of churn on the ownership side as well, because a lot of the companies that actually own the real estate, or the intermediaries between the owners and the actual tenants, a lot of those are facing huge financial shocks. So there's a lot of players moving into the market, particularly private equity, in areas where markets were actually quite owned by rather traditional, established monopoly type positions, which have been very long standing. So there's a lot of churning in the market, and we don't know what the medium and the long term effects of that are. And we do know is also a lot of occupational sorting, that many companies are starting to reassign tasks and opportunities for individual people. So instead of having people in 5 days a week, we want you in 2 days a week, but actually the time that you would have been in those other 5 days a week, we're going to bring other people in who can actually use that time better. And a lot of people inside organizations who were working in more kind of back office functions, many of those jobs are going out of the cities and are being replaced by new entrants. So the kind of Durant-on-Puga spatial sorting, away from sectoral sorting to more functional and spatial sorting, there's actually potentially another generation of that, which is actually underway now. And there's a lot of studies that are taking place at the corporate level internally on these issues. The other issue, which is also relevant here, is any form of capital shocks often leads to a widening of yield rates in terms of the dispersion of yields across places according to the scale and the variety of those places. My guess is those things will kick in again, and that will tend to weaken a lot of weaker places, and a lot of the stronger places, particularly those which are bigger, are probably likely to ride out these shocks in the medium term in a relatively easier manner. So there'll be sorting and reconfiguring inside those cities, but the issue I'm thinking about is particularly between cities. And I think there's 3 areas here. One is any form of capital shock, and investors are still nervous. I mean, just the announcement earlier this week by Jay Powell has suddenly made nervous. Many investors suddenly a week ago were very optimistic and bullish, are suddenly quite bearish. You see this this morning in the FT. So the likelihood of changing dispersion of yield spreads across places, my guess is that will still happen. Secondly, any kind of shifts to form greater concentration of monopoly positions in different markets, which is already happening anyway in many sectors, is likely to increase divergence regionally. And the other area, of course, is governance centralization, where governments effectively have taken over parts of the economy. That tends to lead to greater centralization, which tends to have an associated effect. So my guess is that something like this might happen. I mean, this is an undergraduate urban economics kind of bid rent curve, but the likelihood is, my guess is, in the context such as Europe, where urban hinterlands really are adjacent to each other, is that something like this will start happening. Now, I haven't moved the bid rent curves up and down because I think there are arguments of following what I said, that maybe in the medium term, actually the big cities won't become less productive. There'll be internal sorting, but not relative to the urban ranking across different cities in countries like Italy, UK, Germany, Netherlands, and so on. But I think there will be a lot of encroachment in terms of between hinterlands and smaller cities, which are kind of intermediate areas between more prosperous city regions. My guess is are going to be very vulnerable to this kind of thing happening. So, for example, where I teach in Sheffield, You know, I'm aware of people in Sheffield who live in the outer areas, in the nice little villages around the city. They can commute into the city each day for their jobs, who are now switching to London because they can triple their salary normally by taking a job in London, and they only have to go in 1 or 2 days a week. Suddenly that becomes very meaningful in terms of cost of transportation, cost of travel, cost of time, and also lifestyle. And they're actually moving out of the parts of central Sheffield because it's a smaller and economically weaker city. And they're actually immediately looking at jobs in Manchester. And I know personally of people who are starting to pick up jobs in London who would never have thought about doing that. So my guess is that these kind of things are going to be going on as well, but at the moment we don't know much about it. So I'll stop there, Michelle, okay?
Thank you, Philip. Thank you to the whole panel. Let's open up questions. First, with our colleagues from Canada, Isis, economist in the Department for Economic Development in Southern Ontario. Please go ahead.
Hi, everyone, and thank you to the OECD and the government of Japan for this compelling work, and to our panelists as well for their participation. It's very much appreciated. As observed in many other countries, Canada saw a large shift to remote work following the pandemic lockdowns. Nearly 40% of workers transitioning to some form of remote work. And there's now a growing indication, as people have noted, that this will persist even once all kind of restrictions have fully lifted. According to a Bloomberg survey that was just released in April, 51% of Canadians working from home due to the pandemic said that they would prefer to continue in a hybrid model in some way, where they can divide between the office and remote work. And a third of respondents actually said that they would leave their job if they were not given a flexible work arrangement. I mean, we'll see. But this transition to remote work has already led to some changes in residential purchasing patterns in Canada. And this ties partly to the previous panel as well and Evelyn's comments, but also very much to what our speakers are saying now. While low borrowing costs, a tight supply, and increased demand for single-family homes during the pandemic spurred massive bidding wars and a huge spike in home prices across Canada, with average home prices increasing by 38% compared to last year. Real estate data shows that COVID-19 has also contributed to a convergence in city and periphery housing prices. So this kind of speaks to the donut effect, I think, that Nicholas was speaking to. And this is due to the increased pace and price appreciation seen in satellite towns around some of the urban centers. So for example, in Canada's largest city, Toronto, housing prices from April 2020 to April 2021 increased by 17%, whereas in surrounding communities and including rural areas as far as 2 hours away, saw increases as high as 45%. Although the post-pandemic future of work is not certain, it does seem clear that small towns in the urban periphery have seen massive increases in real estate activity and prices. This boom is also fueling rapidly growing mortgage debt, and this has become an increasing concern for Canadian policymakers. This growing level of indebtedness and the overheated market actually led Canada's banking regulator to announce starting in June that homebuyers will now face tougher mortgage stress tests. And this is decreasing the buying power of most borrowers. These trends raise some interesting concerns for policymakers. If the ongoing dominance of remote work means a permanent shift in settlement patterns, there raises some equity issues around access to housing for current local residences in rural and periphery communities who are increasingly being priced out of their own homes by the migration from urban centers. This risk is also further threatened by the fact that while remote work is often higher paid in sectors that are maybe increasingly untethered to geographic centers, not all workers have the ability to work remotely. And as noted in the report, there are often already fewer jobs conducive to remote work in these actual rural areas. So it is possible that we will start to see even greater societal and economic polarization between people who work from home or have the ability to work from remotely and those who are not. So this raises, sorry,
a couple questions. Just wrap it up so we can get to the questions.
Yeah, of course, raises a couple questions that potentially the panelists can speak to. what are some key actions that we might be able to take that would ensure that these communities are able to take advantage of the opportunities offered by this urban kind of diaspora, but also manage the potential risks to local residents? And also, what are the biggest threats a possible long-term change in settlement patterns might pose to urban centers? That's it.
Okay, thank you, Isis. What I'm going to do is, so we're asking you to stay 7 minutes over time with us, which is a relatively good overtime for us. And I will just ask maybe an additional question to Isis. Let's try since you've talked a little bit about suburbanization trends, I'm going to go more with a question on skills. So what would you say are the implications that panelists see for the globalization of high-skilled work? Are we facing an acceleration and potential outsourcing of high-skilled labor? And on the sense that still in the world, we're talking about skills. If in the new normal we see high-skilled workers moving further away from dense cities, what should policymakers do about different skilled workers, so people not necessarily in the scalable service occupation? So maybe in regard to the question from Isis on the different settlement patterns, we can have Philip and Nicholas take the floor. And then the scalable one, I imagine Fabian or whoever else would like to take the floor on that one.
You want to go first, Nick?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm gonna have to be quick in part because I have to go. Sorry, I have a reasonably hard stop. On skills, I actually talk most about skills. I know that better actually, which is I saw the Q&A. So I just thanks for I totally agree. You know, the US and Canada look very similar in a number of dimensions here. On skills, it is super interesting. So quite a lot of companies I've been talking to have been saying, if people can work from home 5 days a week, why do they need to be in our company? So why can't they just outsource them? And in fact, why can't we offshore them? And the offshoring point, you know, it's a big deal, particularly because of the restrictions on immigration. So Trump in the US and Brexit in the UK, but I mean, more generally because of COVID travel restrictions. Like just to, again, the US, I mean, I know the UK pretty well, but the US as well relied on massive sort of immigrant labor in terms of high skill. And that's all stopped. So in Silicon Valley, you know, tons of companies are basically looking to hire overseas. It works well that people work remote. So why do they need to be remote, you know, in the suburbs in San Francisco? Why can't they just be remote in India? So yeah, for sure. I think much as China's entry into the World Trade Organization in 2001 was a huge explosion in manufacturing trade, I think this is going to end up being a huge explosion in service sector trade and offshoring.
You are muted, Michelle.
Sorry. Yeah, thank you. Thank you. And we understand about the hard stop. Maybe we can continue on skills and then we can get to territorial reallocation with Philip. Go ahead, Fabian.
You want me to respond?
If you would like.
Yeah, I think in terms of the low skilled workers and kind of that dependence on high skill, you know, local spending, in some sense, I think that the pains here are going to be somewhat transitional. If high income workers, you know, migrate away from big cities, you know, low skilled workers will eventually, in some capacity, have to follow that, which I think will probably, in the medium run, be a good thing because it's actually not an easy life as a barista in, you know, in Manhattan. The wages aren't, you know, really compensating for the high cost of living. And so I think there may be some transitional pains, but in the long run, that's probably a better equilibrium to be more dispersed, especially for low skilled workers. Second, yeah, I think that it is like kind of in a super icy, you know, in a world where remote work is much more prevalent, I think we will have to think hard about kind of jobs that are tradable, that can be done remotely, and jobs that can't be. And a lot of really essential jobs actually can't be done remotely. And in some sense, I think that the government has to, or the local city governments have to kind of make sure that these jobs can be provided locally, even in a world that has become super footloose and where in some sense you can't maybe not rely on as steady a stream of demand for local services as you could, you know, in the age of say manufacturing when companies sank investments into the land locally, you know, and make commitments to certain locations.
Okay, thank you, Fabian. And maybe we can take just one last moment with Philip. So for governments, in regards to ISIS's question, what can governments do to help places that may be left behind from the changes due to remote working in particular?
Well, the whole question of kind of what can governments do, so-called left behind places, is a massive issue anyway. This was predating the COVID crisis. Huge numbers of people are struggling with those issues because these divides have accelerated in about half of OECD countries in the last dozen or so years. About half of OECD countries, these things have not really changed, and or those countries have become actually interregionally more equal. But about half of countries, those things have diverged. In some cases, those divergences, such as in the US or the UK, seem to be accelerating. So that's just a hard ask anyway that people are struggling with. But then kind of overlaying the COVID type responses, in a sense, is kind of confusing it as well. It's confusing the debate because it's another layers of complexity. So one argument would be, well, this is good news for places which are left behind. I've heard people advocating this in the press, for example, because suddenly in the UK case, you don't need to be in London, you can live elsewhere, and that ought to flatten these kind of interregional productivity gradients. On the other hand, if following the kind of outsourcing type of issue, if you're going to take advantage of these remote things, why would you subcontract to, I don't know, Birmingham or Manchester when you can go to Bangalore or Santiago? This is an issue which we're not clear on. And across Europe, there's a lot of uncertainty also because of Brexit. And that's not just because of the effects on the UK, but the effects on places like the Netherlands, Northern Germany, and so on. So how these things are going to play out, we don't really understand. I think one minimum thing is if you're at a place which has poor broadband, then you're simply not going to catch any waves. And I think that's something that your own work has been picking up on. Yeah. I mean, there's a report which came out in the last couple of days from the Brookings Metro program. You know, there's infrastructure for telecommuting all over the OECD and across all cities and regions, but there are actually huge differences between places and over quite short distances as well. So the kind of availability and quality of infrastructure is absolutely essential. It's also complicated by the deals which are done by localities with internet service providers. A lot of those end up in kind of monopoly and monopsony type positions. So you might have high level access, but the cost of it is exorbitant. So for businesses, these are actually serious issues. Yeah. So I think we need a lot more thinking around those issues.
Okay, yeah, thanks for that, Phil, Nick, and Fabian. We do, of course, see in the report heavy emphasis on digital infrastructure, and we're doing ongoing work on that, including on the territorial digital divide, as well as some of the other kind of skills related and other socioeconomic factors that may be emerging as we go into the new norm. So thank you so much for being here. Thank you for waiting an extra couple of minutes with us. I'm going to ask Dorothée, thank you, to take the floor. Dorothée is head of division for the Regional Development Policy Committee.
Thank you very much, Michelle. And I want to really thank all of you for your participation in the launch of this study and a fascinating discussion. A special thanks to the panelists for their excellent inputs. And once again, I would like to thank the government of Japan for its support and great cooperation on this project, in particular the Ministry of Land, Infrastructure, Transport and Tourism. So to conclude this event, very briefly, let me mention 4 main points maybe. Firstly, increased hybrid work seems to be the way forward, but we are still at the very early stage and uncertainty is very high on the scale of the shift. Navigating this uncertainty will require increased foresight capacity to understand future scenarios for regional development and related policy areas, in particular, digital infrastructure, housing, land use, and environment, for example. Secondly, as we heard from the first roundtable, shifting to hybrid work presents a number of opportunities for firms in terms of well-being and cost savings, for example. But firm strategy are likely to vary greatly, as we heard. It will depend on the sector, it will depend on the size of the firms. We also know that not all workers and firms can benefit from remote working, and some of the risks associated with this shift to hybrid work are increasing digital divides, especially for the low skilled and for smaller firms. So thirdly, just like for firms, the shift to hybrid work present opportunities and challenges for regions and places. Regions, as we know, tend to specialize in different economic activities, which means they have different remote working capacity, as was discussed extensively. So there is a different geography for remote working. And as we just heard, some regions, like urban regions, have a much higher share of occupation amenable to remote working. All types of regions have opportunity to exploit from the shift to hybrid work. Cities can clearly benefit from a shift with change in office space, improved housing availability, reduced congestion, for example. But of course, there are clear, obvious opportunities for medium-sized cities and rural regions. Affordable housing, lower cost of living, and better access to environmental amenities can attract residents, workers, and firms outside large cities. However, this really requires reducing digital divides, as was mentioned throughout the panel, across urban and rural areas, investing in local public services, notably quality education and healthcare outside large cities, but also developing policy on land use, transport, physical transport, and housing that require very strong coordination. Without adequate support, the risk, just like for firms, is to see an increase in the digital divides and all types of divides across regions and between urban and rural areas in particular. So this is the final point I would like to mention. The actions taken today will shape the future. We heard about the very interesting 4 scenarios, the famous donut effect, the city paradox, the expansion of medium-sized cities, and the business as usual. These scenarios are not comprehensive, and the future can come with a mix of them. But importantly, the scale of the shift will largely depend on the policies implemented by government today. And this is why making the most of the recovery strategies that are currently being implemented by a majority of OECD countries is so crucial. It is a one-off opportunity. It's equivalent to more than 25 times to the Marshall Plan if we compare to 50 years ago. So it's a one-off opportunity which should not be wasted. Before closing, I just would like to mention that given the importance of this work, we intend to continue working on forward-looking scenarios in the coming months. So this event is not the end, but rather the end of the beginning. We plan to expand this work on scenario planning to help regions benefit from this shift to hybrid work. We also want these forward-looking scenarios to feed our regional recovery platform that we are currently putting in place. This platform will track the recovery path of all OECD regions, promote knowledge exchange, and support scenario planning by government to adapt their policies for the future. We stand ready to assist government and regions in making the most of this hybrid work and preventing negative scenarios of increased territorial divides. We look forward to continuing engaging with all of you, governments, private actors, academics, on all these critical topics. Thank you very much again to all.
Thank you, Dorothée. I would just like to say thank you for everyone to being here at the close of this session. We will see you at our next event at the work stream that is tied to this work stream. And a special thank you to Natalia Zakria, who has been a great translator for today. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.